tardes. Estamos hoy de nuevo en el Seminario de Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas. Y es para mí un placer tener hoy a Susan Brown. Es profesora del University of California, Irvine, profesora en Sociología, y además está afiliada al Center for Research on Immigration y al Center for Demographic and Social Analysis. So, welcome to el Colegio de México, Susan. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. And hoy estamos en el Colegio de México para presentar Parents Without Papers, The Progress and Pitfalls of Mexican-American Integration. Y es un libro en coautoría con Frank Bean y James Bachmeyer. And I would start, we're going to talk a bit about the book, but one of the very interesting results that you find is that the integration of Mexican Americans in the United States has, on the one hand, being complicated to study. It's challenging to study integration. And one of the things I really like of the book is that you talk a lot about immigration policy, but also immigrant integration policy, trying to see what's the effect, let's say, of unauthorized status, right? So, and I think it's really important for the seminar to understand first of all, how do policies shape inequality? But also, one of the things that you actually find and discuss is that inequality in the United States exists independently of immigration, right?
Absolutely.
And so immigrants arrive to this unequal context, and you also explain in the book how the inequality has widened. Right? So my first thing would be, how do we study Mexican-American integration in a context of inequality, in a context where inequality has widened, but also what are the difficulties of studying it? En esta primera sección me gustaría enfocarnos en los desafíos para estudiar la integración de los mexicanos americanos en Estados Unidos, justamente en un contexto donde la desigualdad ha aumentado a lo largo del tiempo.
That's a big question. For one thing, to study Mexican-American integration, especially in a context of widening inequality, is to understand that there is no such thing as an average Mexican-American, that the averages mask a lot of variation in the group. And we try to show some of that. We try to show it particularly across generations, because generations seem to matter a lot. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the ways that we try to get at that idea. But it's really very challenging, and it is the political question that we're grappling with now, even after we've written the book, is when you have widening inequality, when the middle class as a whole is struggling to maintain being in the middle class, how do you look at one immigrant group that's just getting there? What are the challenges facing them, and are they really different from the country as a whole? I'm not sure so much that they are. And so we try to look at the Mexican-American integration in a much bigger picture as well. And methodologically, it's a challenge as well, as you were suggesting, trying to figure out which generation you're looking at.
Right.
So how can I answer something more specifically then?
So maybe it would be interesting to say, when we discuss migration, we discuss generations, we usually look at the first generation, the migrants themselves, their children, which is usually the second generation, 1.5 depending on their age of arrival, and then we talk a lot about the third plus generation, right? But one of the things that you actually say is, no, let's focus on the third generation only. What is the third generation only? It's the grandparents, right?
Right.
It's the parents of the immigrants themselves. So one of the very important things that you do is, let's link the parents with the children and the grandparents, right? These three generations. So maybe my first question would be, what are the advantages of looking at the effects of unauthorization status within these three generations?
Well, first of all, unauthorized status, as the whole point of the book, is that when parents arrive unauthorized and stay unauthorized. They can't change their legal status, which is a huge policy question right then and there. But when policy prevents them from being able to change their legal status, their children grow up disadvantaged in any number of structural ways. They fall behind the children of people who could legalize, and they fall behind them in terms of education, in terms of income, even in terms of the language that they choose to speak at home. They don't live in the same quality of neighborhood. So there are many, many different dimensions on which the children of unauthorized migrants fall behind. And even though they themselves might be legal, and so they don't pass along.
Or born in the United States.
Because they were born in the United States. Because they were born in the United States, they're legal, but they grow up with all these disadvantages. And we know from the transmission of advantage across generations that matters. So even the grandchildren of unauthorized migrants can fall behind and can be disadvantaged because their grandparents were unauthorized. So what we show is that, yes, indeed, by the third generation, there's been a lot of catch-up, but it's not perfect. And so the disadvantage of having parents who cannot legalize because of policy is enormous, and it has repercussions that can last half a century or more.
Now, empirically, it has been hard to measure, to detect the third generation only, right? Because,
very much.
Empirically, my question would be, how does this study overcome those limitations linked to the data availability, to the most part, right?
Very few surveys, practically none, in fact, ask anymore where grandparents were born, or even where parents were born. Sometimes they'll get where parents were born. But if you know where parents were born, then you only get a third plus generation. Because if parents were legal, then grandparents were citizens. Grandparents could have been citizens. Great-grandparents could have been citizens. You don't know how far back. But if you can ask whether grandparents came to the United States or were born somewhere else, then you can get a real third generation. And having a real third generation is important because, as the work of Steve Trejo and Brian Duncan has shown, people tend to lose their identification with ethnicity, particularly if there's been outmarriage in the family. So by the time you might get to the fourth or fifth or sixth generation, people who had some ancestors who came from Mexico are not necessarily going to identify as Mexican-American. So they never get into surveys. And what Duncan and Trejo have found is that people who identify as Mexican-American tend to be negatively selected in these surveys. And that means that the ones who don't identify but might have Mexican ancestors are never caught up in the pool of Mexican Americans. And the result is it looks as if their education is a little lower, their income is a little lower, and there's slippage. And the reason for that slippage is that outmarriage is more common among people who are more highly educated and earn more. And it's the children of people who have outmarried who are less likely to identify as Mexican Americans. And so you have self-identification into surveys of people who are negatively selected. And the ones who are positively selected don't identify necessarily as Mexican Americans. Now, curiously, it works the other way for Asians. Asians who are self-selected tend to be positively self-selected to identify as Asians. So that makes it look as if Asian Americans are doing
better.
super well.
It's interesting because in the social sciences, we talk a lot about selection, right? And how the selection biases the results. But in this sense, you're highlighting selection in terms of, in relationship with national origin, right? And I guess that would be a first challenge, right? How does selection attrition that you discuss in the book relate to really understanding integration patterns, right? So I guess one of the challenges is trying to detect these biases to actually try to understand better the pathways of integration, right? Which for the Mexican Americans, it has been, as you said, negatively associated.
Well, one thing we did, which other people haven't done yet, and it was astonishing to us really, was we separated out a third generation, people who had grandparents born in Mexico, versus people who said they were of Mexican ancestry but did not have any grandparents born in Mexico. And the difference between the groups was huge. The third generation who had grandparents born in Mexico were doing very well. And the ones who said they were Mexican-American but didn't have any Mexican-born grandparents were not doing nearly so well. And they didn't relate to the first generation or the second generation in any really systematic way. It just looked like a completely different sample of people.
Which is super interesting and
It is.
astonishing, as you said.
It was, and so that was what led us to realize you really need to try to separate out this third generation, which in many ways, seemed to continue a trajectory of the first generation, the second, and then the third. And then you had this third plus, or I should say fourth plus, really. It's fourth plus generation of people who's
A mix.
probably a mix, and how they identified this way, it was very unclear.
Yeah. So, I mean, the studies, the results from the book are coming from the Immigration and Intergenerational Mobility in Metropolitan Los Angeles study, right?
Yes.
And, I mean, you're here tomorrow to talk a little bit more about the implications of how to study migration in a longitudinal way, in a longitudinal perspective. But what other advantages does this study have in terms of trying to understand time and generation and things that change over time in a longitudinal perspective, trying to look at different cohorts and different generations?
Well, what we did was we asked the children of immigrants about their parents' migration status. So it was retrospective data, but we asked them how they came into the country, what kind of visa status they had at the time. That was the kind of question we were allowed to ask by our IRB, which is a whole other story of what kind of questions you're allowed to ask. So we asked them about what visas their parents had when they came in. And then we asked them whether their parents' visa status changed and whether their parents were citizens. And by looking at the visa status change over time, the trajectory there, we got a sense of whether they had probably arrived unauthorized and been able to legalize, or whether they had been legal from the get-go. And so we could look at the trajectory over time. And one of the things that we were open-minded about finding was, well, what happens if your parents come in as unauthorized labor migrants and can legalize? Is that going to hurt you? Because we weren't sure. And it turned out it didn't at all. It was when parents stayed unauthorized that it mattered.
Yeah, and I mean, what's really interesting is that I think this is one of the really few studies that look at the trajectories for understanding mobility, right? I mean, you have studies that show what happens when people naturalize, when people legalize. But here, it's really clear that what matters is the trajectory, right?
Yes, absolutely.
What matters is the combinations of status. What matters is what, not only, and sometimes we talk about parents, but there are differences if it's a mother or the father who is unauthorized, right?
Yes.
And you do a lot of analysis by gender, and you put a lot of attention of gender differences. So I guess, I mean, personally, I see also these challenges in trying to understand methodological integration as, first of all, there are gender differences and there are trajectories that matter, right? And this is really hard to study many times in cross-sectional studies.
Very much so. What we found was the trajectory of the mother was more influential than the trajectory of the father. And in part, we would say this is, well, mothers are more responsible for rearing children than the fathers are usually, but also mothers who are unauthorized have very few lucrative job opportunities. They don't have a chance to make any kind of good money, whereas a father might be able to get some labor work that paid okay, not great, but okay. For a mother, that wouldn't probably be true. And so you would have both an income problem as well as mothers being the ones who are responsible for rearing children most likely.
Yeah. So I mean, do you see as, I mean, what would be your recommendations? Let's say if someone arrives and says, I want to study immigrant integration, what would be the 3 methodological recommendations for this person to study? Like, try and summarize a bit the challenges that you found.
Well, the challenges that we found are trying to determine legal status, first of all, because you just can't go ask somebody, are you an unauthorized migrant? That doesn't really fly, and you can't. Your university won't let you do that anyway. So finding a group of questions where you can get people to answer the question and to feel comfortable about it is certainly an issue.
Sorry, let me just interrupt. I guess another implication would be to move away from the dichotomy of authorized and unauthorized, right? I mean, you see different types of visas, you see different types of trajectories that sometimes you can be unauthorized in a very different ways.
Right. You can come as a student and overstay a visa. You can come on a tourist visa and overstay that. You can have an H-1B and not be able to change it to a permanent residency status. There are all these different ways that people can come into the country legally and then lose legal status.
Or you can have a border crossing card and work unauthorizedly but be there with authorization, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, just trying to see, one of the things I would say is that it's interesting how you show the trajectories, but also trying to move away from this dichotomy, right, of authorized and unauthorized, even if legalization is a major turning point.
Yes,
right?
it is a major turning point, and because it can be so fluid and so hard, and people can stay in a limbo for a long time, getting permanent legal status is a huge change, more so we found than citizenship, and we were not really expecting to find that, but permanent legal status was critical for the trajectory of the children.
So the first, going back to our recommendations, the first one would be trying to understand and really measure correctly these different trajectories of statuses.
That's right, and that's hard. And one thing we wish we had asked was whether the parents had been able to take advantage of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, because it turned out that it looked as if a lot of them did. A whole lot of them were able to take advantage of that, which was an enormous policy boon to the Mexican population in the United States in the 80s. But
you didn't
we didn't
directly
ask that question directly, so we've had to infer it, looking at when the parents came, if they came before or after 1982. So we've had to dance around that. So we would have asked that if we could do it all over again. We were very glad we asked about where the grandparents were born, all 4 of them.
Yeah.
And so for anyone else, I would certainly suggest trying to get a 3rd generation and look at where grandparents were born. You can't ask about great-grandparents because people don't know where their great-grandparents were born, but they do generally know about grandparents. So that's another thing that I would certainly recommend.
And something else? A 3rd recommendation? I mean, I personally, when I read the book, I thought that it's really interesting how you talk about the multidimensionality of integration. Because sometimes we tend to focus only on economic integration, linguistic integration, spatial assimilation, but you do a lot of trying to bring this together and how they relate to each other. So, I mean, I personally would recommend people to look at different dimensions of integration.
Oh, absolutely. And getting all of those different dimensions, especially some of the cultural ones that for us were a little bit hard to measure. How do people self-identify? We asked an open-ended question about that, and we got answers that were all over the book. But so that wasn't critical, but we asked about the salience of ethnicity, and that turned out to be pretty important for people, as well as Spanish language and television watching. The problem, of course, is these days getting hold of people, particularly when you have a policy climate right now in the United States where there are a lot of people who are afraid, and you have people who are reachable only by cell phones. So it's very hard to even mount a survey right now.
Yeah. And I mean, let me just ask you something briefly to try to pull everything together and before we finish, because your study is in Los Angeles, and it's a very particular, I think it's a very interesting and important location, but I don't know how, I mean, how different would things would have looked if we looked, if the study was done in other contexts, and we know that context of reception matters a lot, right? And this is, I mean, you don't talk a lot about it in the book, but we are all aware that Los Angeles is playing a key role in these patterns.
We would love to compare this to Texas. And because that's the only other place where you really have three generations or more that and Texas historically was a very different kind of place for Mexican Americans than California historically. But the education provided by Texas has gone way up faster than Californians did, because California had a relatively high educational standard for its residents a long time ago, whereas Texas, as part of the South, had lower levels of education, not only for Mexican Americans, but also for whites. And so the education levels of the people who came early in the 20th century were low in Texas, and they were low for everyone. So when you look at grandparents' education, if the grandparents came from Texas, it was very different than if grandparents came from California, because the educational systems were different. And so looking at trajectories over time in Texas and comparing that to California would, for me, be a really interesting study.
Well, I hope we have funding to do a study like that.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah.
It's a fourth methodological challenge, finding money these days to do a study like that.
That's the fourth, fifth, and sixth.
Yes. Well, I guess with that big challenge, I'm going to finish the discussion today. But thank you very much for being here. And muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos en esta sesión del seminario de Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas. Y los dejamos en una siguiente sesión. Muchas gracias.